listening to the Carleton Political Science Podcast, brought to you by the Department of Political Science at Carleton University in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. I'm Asif Hamid, one of the PhD students with the program. Traditionally, the fall is a time of transition, not only in terms of weather, but for students to begin a new year, to enter a new classroom, a whole new environment. However, COVID-19 has changed things. For teachers and teaching staff at Carleton and universities across the country, this has meant engaging in a pedagogical shift unlike any time in history, and moving instruction almost entirely online. This continental shift has come with its fair share of challenges that professors, teaching assistants, and students themselves are trying to find solutions to every day. How can one create a meaningful educational experience for students online? How do we foster community in a socially distant environment? And are there actually opportunities for innovation hidden deep within distance education? And how could these pave the way for progressive and enlightened pedagogy? To discuss these questions and more, I'm joined by Professor Jonathan Malloy. A pillar of our little community here at Carleton, Professor Malloy has been with the Department of Political Science for over 2 decades, taking on the role of department chair from 2012 to 2018. A renowned expert in Canadian politics, as well as mentorship and career development for graduate students, Professor Malloy is the current Bell Chair in Canadian Parliamentary Democracy and will chair the CPSA annual conference next year, a Congress 2021. Thank you, Professor Malloy, for joining us today.
It's great to be here.
So, it's been 6 months since the world's changed, and the pandemic caused this huge sort of retrenchment of life, and it's happened in academia as well. So I was just wondering if you could take us back to that moment. What was it like for you when you got that stay-at-home order, and how did the department, and perhaps Carleton more broadly, take on that decision?
Well, it's really striking to look back, and I was recently looking back at some of the emails and documents and things from early March, just when the pandemic was clearly coming to Canada, but we had no idea about just how much what we'd have to do about it, and it's really striking. I remember particularly the week of what would have been, I guess, March 9th. I remember my class was on Wednesday afternoon. I remember on Tuesday afternoon, I had office hour, and the student came to me wearing a mask, which I found kind of surprising. And the student asked me if I was planning to move my class online because of the coronavirus, and I was very concerned. And I sympathized with the student, but I thought, well, I don't think we'll be doing that. We won't be moving online or anything. We'll just sort of have to maybe be a little more careful, wash our hands more, etc. And then the next day I had the class, which turned out to be my last in-person class. And I remember I made some remarks about the coronavirus at one point, and a student put up their hand and said, Laurentian University just closed entirely, which shocked me because they did have an early outbreak. And then that class ended, and I never would have thought that would be my final in-person class for who knows how long. And then further, the next day, on the Thursday, I stood in the University Board of Governors. And I must say that was a very interesting Board of Governors meeting that afternoon. Went several hours. And just during the course of the meeting, it was clear that the mood had changed a bit. The university was certainly taking the coronavirus, as we called it back then, very seriously. But the idea of actually closing the university to all in-person classes, moving online, was just something that no one could wrap their minds around. And in the middle of that meeting was when the province of Ontario announced that schools will be closed for 3 weeks, which shocked us. And just on and on. I can remember a number of just times and meetings all that week where it just gradually moved, and things that we just could not contemplate 24 hours later started to happen. And so if you look back at sort of emails and documents of that time, it's striking to see just how we just couldn't imagine what was coming by any means. But at the same time, I think we did adapt. And to get the second part of your question, I think how sort of the department and Carleton took on the decision, I think I'm really happy with the transition we did. The idea of moving all courses online, almost inconceivable, I think worked fairly well. I think in the department and at Carleton generally, I think considering the momentous nature of the task, I think it was reasonably smooth. I think the university took a flexible approach in terms of letting instructors make decisions based on their courses. In some other universities, they were much more directive. They essentially told instructors what they could and cannot do, or instructors had to get approval for any changes. Carleton took quite a light touch, which I think was the appropriate touch. And so I would say that the winter term moved online about as seamlessly as it could have under the circumstances. So I would say that, and I'm frankly really happy with how the university and my colleagues in the department were able to make this transition. This completely unimaginable scenario took place, and I think people took it in a good stride. They listened to public health authorities. They realized that we had to be innovative. We had to be particularly compassionate for students who were caught in all these areas. And that was a big part of it, was just the effect on students. So overall, I think we handled it, I think, reasonably well. But the decision making was just it was just amazing how fast we had to make decisions and how much the circumstances changed. And I must say, speaking as a scholar of public policy, someday we're going to look back on all this and document it more thoroughly. And it's going to be an absolutely fascinating study of decision making. So for me personally, I think for all, it was a huge mindset change. And now 6 months later, we're so used at this point to social distancing and staying at home and other norms like that. But it's just, if you go back to, say, the first week of March, no one could have contemplated anything like this, and yet this is where we ended up. And so I'm happy that we as a university and institution handled it about as well as we could.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that sort of institutional response, because when we look at post-secondary institutions in Canada, we can see there's some variation, but for the most part, there's pretty broad consistency in terms of taking on that stay-at-home order and going online. Then you look at like kindergarten to grade 12 education, and it's a lot different. There's not that sort of seamless transition and more questions. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, first to the part about post-secondary education institutions in Canada, I must say I'm pretty happy as well. And it sounds like I'm patting ourselves on the back. I hope not too much. But the way the Canadian post-secondary educational sector has adapted to COVID, I think, has been pretty good. Institutions have largely moved online. Some universities are holding some in-person classes, but Carleton has gone, to all extents, completely online, and that's been the norm for almost all Canadian institutions. If you compare it with, say, the United States, right below us, where it's quite a chaotic approach, where most institutions did plan to remain largely in person. Some then have reverted back to online very suddenly, and it's a huge chaotic mess in the United States. And that reflects a number of things. I think one thing it does reflect is that in the United States, there's a stronger model of residential education where students go away to school, they live on campus, and that's the model of the environment, particularly the most prestigious schools. In Canada, the majority of students are commuters who live at home with their parents, and we just have a few institutions that are really primarily residential, and those ones are going more on in person, such as St. Francis Xavier, Acadia University, Queen's up to a point. So they've been more in person, but just generally the Canadian post-secondary sector has largely moved online, and with, I think, relatively little contention. There's lots of implementation issues, but there's a broad consensus on the way to go. When it comes, though, to K-12 education, that is the main part of your question here. It's obviously much more difficult. And I would identify a number of factors there. I think one is that K-12 public education serves a number of public purposes. It, of course, is about educating and children, first of all, but it's all, schools are just integrated into our society in a wider sort of way. They serve a much wider population, and parents are very involved in K-12 education in a way that they are not in post-secondary education. And so when you look at I won't quite call it chaos in Ontario for K-12, but certainly quite a disarray and a lot of discontent. A part of it is because there's a number of different actors involved here. Government, teachers, school boards, of course, which have their own sort of role here, and parents, of course, are really the dominant actors. It's not the children themselves, generally. It's the parents who are the main sort of stakeholder group, so to speak. So it's a much more complex environment going on. There's a lot more, I think, complexities at stake. Whereas to go back to the post-secondary sector, again, parents and other stakeholders can be involved, but it's primarily about serving adult students who are should be able to make their own decisions and conduct themselves in certain ways and manage their own studies. So it's frankly a lot simpler for the post-secondary sector. And whereas for the K to 12, I look back at what's going on in Ontario and in all provinces, and it's such a difficult situation. And to me, part of it is because there's so many stakeholder groups. There's clearly no single right course of action for going. There's no single sort of solution. Money can solve some problems, but it certainly can't solve all of the issues here. It's a much more complex policy environment. So I think we're seeing a lot more variations within the K to 12 sector, because it's in the end it's about every small individual school, and there's dozens and dozens of schools in Ottawa alone. There's school boards, there's the Ministry of Education, there are teachers and teachers unions, and there are parents, and of course there are the children, the students themselves. So it's a much more complex environment where decision making is much more difficult. And again, post-secondary education is pretty complex itself, but in this case, it's the parameters are more simple, and the stakeholders, I think, are more simplified than K to 12. And so as a result, we've been able to move much more with a consensus approach and relatively good implementation in post-secondary education compared to the kaleidoscope disarray that is the K to 12 sector.
Next, I want to go back to something we'd spoken about earlier, and that's online instruction. Because to me, it's this really fascinating thing. Like, you mentioned how in the winter semester, there's this kind of just general push towards it because we didn't have a choice. And there was, for a while, people, professors, students, teaching assistants, supporting staff, we were all really struggling to adapt. But as someone who's been teaching at university for a while, what do you think are the biggest challenges with this move online? And do you look towards the move online and see any opportunities for innovations or better pedagogy along the way?
Well, that's a great question. So there are two sort of questions there that I think work well together. In terms of sort of the biggest challenge of the move online, I think from the instructor point of view, the biggest challenge is simply having to adapt and change so much. That to try and to adapt all of your teaching techniques, approach, content, assignments, and everything to an online environment. That's a huge challenge. But I think there is, as they say, a silver lining to every cloud, and this is a case where that there has been an opportunity to change and adapt. And I will say, frankly, I think for a lot of instructors like me who have been doing this for quite a few years, it's useful to have the impetus to rethink your course. And I mean, it's certainly been challenging for instructors to have to sort of to really think about their entire course from top to bottom, about every aspect, every assignment, all the content and all that, trying to decide how to move it online, whether it needs to be done there. So it's certainly been a very daunting task. But it's certainly, I think, the pandemic and moving online has, and many people have said this, has really led to probably the biggest advance and revolution in teaching pedagogy ever in post-secondary education, because everyone has had to really go zero-based and rethink from scratch how they teach courses and what to do. So, and I don't want to minimize the disruption, the difficulty for instructors having to do all this, but I think it has allowed people to try new things, to realize that there are a number of advantages to the online environment, that perhaps some things that they were always doing in the in-person class could be jettisoned without a lot of impact on the learning outcomes of the class. So, it's been difficult, but it has helped instructors to rethink. From the student point of view, again, I think there certainly are both advantages and disadvantages. I think one thing that I think people have immediately focused on quite rightly is issues of access. That to be taking courses online requires reasonable access to technology, to a laptop, to Wi-Fi, and other access like that, for a space in their home, whatever their home is, to be able to work, etc. There's all sorts of sort of issues there, and a lot has been raised about how students are going to have uneven access to this. And Carleton has certainly devoted some resources to that. There is a fund for students to get a modest amount of money towards new technology. So the university has tried to address that a bit. But certainly that's a big issue, is that for a lot of students, there are access issues. I should say for instructors as well. Often, sometimes they have to struggle with that as well. The online classes mean, of course, that students are not on campus. They're not interacting with each other in person. There are some opportunities to be involved in campus activities, clubs, and so on online. But obviously, it's different than in person. It's much more restrained in how you can do that. I would say, though, again, that what I'm just observing very, very anecdotally and very sporadically just in the initial weeks of the term. But it does seem that students are connecting a lot online, more, I think, than they would have otherwise. Because all the classes at Carleton are online, students are doing other interactions online. So they're setting up a lot of their own communications, often through social media and other things that the university does not use. We can't really use officially for privacy reasons. But students are setting up their own groups on social media on various platforms, many platforms that often a person like me is only dimly aware of. So students are connecting online, I think, in a way that they probably might not have if they've been sitting in an in-person lecture. So hopefully there are at least, again, some opportunities. The move to online has been so disruptive. It's come at a lot of cost for a lot of people. But certainly, I hope that some aspects are actually improving, that there's actually an improvement in learning in some ways for the classes. So this is just kind of anecdotal over early weeks into the fall term, but it's certainly not all bad. I think we're certainly not going to be teaching online forever. I certainly think that there's a big thirst to coming back to in-person classes, to the more face-to-face interaction with people. But we've had a chance to really test online learning, and I think a lot of skeptics have realized that there are advantages to it. At the same time, I should say that a lot of people, should we say, prophets of online technology, who said that online was a solution to everything, have also been proven wrong. So some things just can't be replicated. Some things are not as good. But overall, so I think the whole move, I think, to online instruction has been challenging, but there's definitely been some good opportunities and advances that have come out of this as well.
One big disappointment for many in the academy was the loss of conference season this year. I mean, just anecdotally, everyone I know was meant to go somewhere. I had 4 conferences personally that were ended up being canceled because of the pandemic. And, I know you're chairing CPSA next year, which is one of the largest Canadian political science conferences there is. Just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how conferences can evolve and adapt to meet the challenge of COVID-19?
Another great question. And I mean, I think that's a question that, a bit like the teaching of things, that there's been a lot of disruption, a lot of problems, but possibly, not possibly, surely, some opportunities out of all of this. So yeah, I think that for a lot of academics in particular, the loss of conference season has been a big deal. For me as well, there are a number of conferences that I was planning to go to. They're always very stimulating and exciting. It's a chance to travel. It's a chance to do new things. And all that, of course, has disappeared. And I think that back when the pandemic was first declared, and very quickly some conferences like ISA, for example, collapsed at the last minute. And I think it was very short term. I think people realized that sort of the spring conference season was clearly not going to happen, but that even that took a while there. I think back in March and April, no one was really thinking. We had lots to think about the time. No one was really thinking long term about the fall, winter, and well into 2021. What would happen? We were focused rightly, I think, on the short term. And it's quite clear that now, here we are talking in September 2020, that this is going to go on for a while. That, I mean, I'm not going to make speculations about the long-term nature of the pandemic, about vaccines, and things like that. All we know is that when it comes to people responsible for planning conferences, including the Canadian Political Science Association meetings, which are indeed scheduled for early June 2021 as part of the Congress of the Social Sciences and Humanities, we have to make decisions now about what that format is going to be. And so I can't tell you exactly what the decisions are yet for next June. But I will say certainly that it's highly unlikely we're going to have a traditional in-person conference. And it will be almost certainly at least partly online, perhaps entirely online. We're having discussions about that right now, just as other conferences scheduled for early 2021 are already going fully virtual there. So we're going to be doing virtual conferences for some time. And I think it's, again, a chance, as with teaching, it's a chance to rethink conferences entirely. I've always been a very big fan of academic conferences, both large and small. I found them to be very useful and very useful to do in person, because you can attend and hear people's work, hear presentations, ask questions. But it's also all the interaction, all the informal interaction with people, whether it's sort of meeting new individuals, meeting old friends, having discussions, and all that. It was always just a tremendously stimulating experience. The full range of conferences. And with online conferences, you can replicate a little bit of that, but you just can't have the same degree of informal contact, especially sort of informal, sporadic, random contact in conversations that one has an in-person conference. So I think for the short term, I think people are doing their best to try and replicate what they can for conferences. So the American Political Science Association had their conference online in early September, and by all accounts, it was reasonably successful. It was basically the opposite conference with standard panels and everything, all held at the regular times. And I think people did find it to be a reasonable experience, perhaps not the same as traveling, but reasonable. And so I think down the line we are going to see virtual conferences where people are making best efforts, and it may not be it's not the same as an in-person travel conference, but it can still be a stimulating intellectual experience to hear other people's work and to comment on it. And of course, the big thing, this is where we're getting to sort of rethinking conference entirely, is one of the huge benefits about a virtual conference is that you don't have to travel anywhere. That's the downside. You don't get to travel, but there's so much discussion these days, more and more, about the accessibility of conferences, particularly for people who do not have tenured positions, who do not have access to grants and funds for travel. Conferences can be expensive, and it's certainly something that there's, I think, a lot of discussion, awareness about whether conferences, even before the pandemic, should have gone more virtual, or should have had more virtual elements to be more accessible to people, so that they did not have to pay hundreds or thousands of dollars to attend the conferences. So I think that again, part of moving to virtual is that it may be that some conferences will stay entirely virtual, that they can really meet a lot of their objectives of presenting scholarship and discussing scholarly ideas in person, with a virtual conference that can be put on at very low cost, not no cost. Often there's going to be a lot of technical cost to putting these on, but certainly it doesn't pose the same sorts of travel costs for individuals. So, I mean, some conferences may stay on virtual, because in the end, people will not be forced to spend lots of money just to go and present a paper. But also, I do hope that also it will spur a lot of conferences in the long term. And I'm sure eventually we will be meeting back in person. It will spur a lot of conferences to really think carefully about the value that they're delivering for conferences. And I've certainly been at conferences. I've seen people attend conferences where you really just sort of show up and have the panel and presentation, and that's about all. There isn't necessarily much else, or certainly not a great deal of sort of added value. And sometimes you think, well, we could have just done this online. I think that most conferences, and certainly the Congress of Social Sciences and Humanities, which the CPSA meets as part of, has always tried hard to really make the in-person experience a big part of it. With, for example, book exhibitions, interactions, lots of social events and things there. They've always tried really to bring value to actually traveling and having the in-person conference. And I think there's going to be even more emphasis on that. I think following all of this, I think that every conference organizer is going to have to rethink very carefully what's the value that we are putting on for this conference. We're asking people to pay registration fees, to travel, to take time away from their families, whatever, to come. What is the value that we're delivering? And so hopefully there'll be a lot of focus on delivering really good in-person experiences. Lots of, whether it's informal experiences, interactions, whatever, you can be creative there. So I think in the long term, hopefully, As with teaching, there's been a lot of disruption, a lot of disappointment, but hopefully, again, it will actually force us to sort of rethink things a bit and really give good value for the in-person experience, and realize that often in other areas, online might be quite reasonable, and might achieve the goals. So we're forced to rethink a lot of things here.
But that's how innovation happens, right? Meet a problem,
It absolutely is.
The last kind of question I want to ask on this topic is, for many students who've been at Carleton and other universities abroad, this has marked a huge change in terms of how they engage education. But there's also a great number of students who are new to our community here at Carleton, and this is their first foray into post-secondary education. For those who are taking those first steps under these extraordinary circumstances, what advice would you give?
Well, it's obviously very challenging, I think, for any particularly first year student starting university, but it's starting undergraduate, also just first year graduate students, perhaps new to Carleton, coming in. It's obviously a pretty strange experience to be starting online. Normally, when people start at university, the university makes a big push to try and give them a orientation, to connect people, etc., to really socialize them into the campus community. When you're restricted to online only, and people are not really even located in Ottawa, that's a lot more challenging. You can do some things online, but you can only do so much. People can only be comfortable interacting so much through a screen. Again, online always tends to be more formal in that way, and so a lot of the sort of the tools and tricks that universities have tried to use particularly to socialize students and give them the supportive environment early on are not really available. On the other hand, I would say that there's still a lot that can be done. I mean, I think that we've tried very hard to develop good online courses. There's a lot of variance, I have to say. People are trying different things and all that, but certainly we've tried to make sure that the learning experience for students is largely unharmed by all this disruption. And I think, and this would be my advice to students, regardless of pandemic or not, in person or online like that, it's open up to students to make the most of the opportunities that university gives them. They can sit through the lectures, they can complete the assignments, but they also need to really sort of look for opportunities to reach out. The one thing I always recommend to new students, again, undergraduate, graduate, is to reach out to faculty. Like that, faculty are always interested in interacting with students, but obviously we respond better when the students reach out to us. The students make it clear that they're interested in chatting with us, and we're always happy to do so. So building relationships with instructors, I think, is always a key. That can be more challenging in a large course, and there's hundreds of students there, but you can still reach out. And I think, again, here's where online may be an advantage. I think that most students today, particularly I think first-year undergraduates, are much more comfortable, I think, conversing online, texting rather than talking on the phone, etc. So I think hopefully for many students, they might actually feel more comfortable reaching out to their instructors by messaging, by email, whatever, rather than phoning them up or coming to their office hour, which very few students do in person there. So I hope students might actually feel more comfortable because we're interacting only online and increasingly often asynchronously through messaging. Students may actually feel more comfortable, hopefully, reaching out and building relationships with instructors, and then also with fellow students. And again, this is another thing that the university tries to do, but we can only do so far. It's up to students themselves, is to connect with each other. And so I would, again, really advise, students, whether, again, new undergraduates or graduate students, to really reach out to each other. And again, because we're in an online environment, you may not be able to see anyone in person like that, or sort of bump into them in the hall, but you do have access to usually to people's names, to contact information, and to reach out, to build informal communities, to be prepared to make that first step to reach out. And not everyone is going to respond, but to really take some initiative to reach out there. So I think that just for all students coming in, making first steps at Carleton, or returning students as well, look for the opportunities. Just reach out. It can be difficult, it can be daunting, but they are there. And I guess the last thing I would just say a bit is about ongoing resilience. Again, I think we are in a global pandemic. We are on all sorts of social restrictions. Most people are stuck at home, and home means different things for people in terms of circumstances. That it can be very stressful for people. There's all sorts of things going on. And again, I would say this again, whether we were in person or online, don't be afraid to ask for help. Don't be afraid to reach out. Reach out to instructors, to TAs at first if you're having difficulties and things there, and please don't hesitate to reach out to other parts of the university, to health counseling services, to the Office of Student Affairs there, because people are always struggling with mental health issues and issues. I do as well. These are things that people have had long before pandemics, and but a lot of those have been exacerbated obviously by our circumstances there. And so I do say to reach out for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help, to say you're struggling, that you have issues going on. There are people really willing to listen, and quite often you're not the only person sort of struggling in this. You may have particular issues, particular challenges to deal with, but everyone's struggling with some issues, I think. And the more you reach out and speak up about them, frankly, the better.
Yeah, it's one thing I've kind of always said since maybe 10 days into being at this program. I've been in big institutions and big departments, U of T, York. I've never been in a department that's had the sense of community that ours has. And so I would just mirror that comment and repeat it as well. People can reach out and we'll always respond, I think.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I said, and community doesn't just happen. You can't just, an institution can't just create it. You can't create it by memo or even throwing money at it sometimes. Assist sometimes. It's because people choose to reach out to each other and to build and to feed and build up that community, and that's great that you experienced that. And I know you also you yourself give back a lot to that community, so it is there, and people should take advantage of it and contribute to it.
So I've got one more question, and this is relatively unrelated. It's the question I pose to everyone I do these podcasts with, and I think it's especially important for you because you're a pillar of that community at Carleton. What's the sort of stuff you've been working? Oh. I mean, it's part of the reason why it's so good here, right? But I'm just interested, I'm sure the people listening as well. What are you working on these days? I know you're on sabbatical, so perhaps you're not even working on anything. But what sort of stuff's been going on in the life of John Malloy professionally?
Sure. Well, the little premise of your question there, I think, is sort of interesting itself. I think that whether I'm working at all on sabbatical, and I do say that I think in the academic world, sabbaticals are very common for tenured faculty. It's usually part of our employment agreement. But academics have a somewhat weird view of sabbaticals, because sabbatical, I'm pretty sure the word means a rest from work. I'm pretty sure that's the roots in the Bible and elsewhere. What it means is a rest from work. And in other lines of work and stuff that people sometimes have the opportunity of a sabbatical and stuff, usually means exactly that. They leave their workplace, they go off, they travel, they do something like that, but they definitely don't do their regular work. In universities, it's a little different. A sabbatical means that a faculty member is relieved from their teaching work. They don't have to teach. They usually are exempt from any service responsibility, so that sort of work. But it's all because then they can surge ahead and focus on their research work and have a huge surge of productivity on their research, which is also work, I believe. So I always think there's a certain, I'm not sure if it's an irony or whatever, that for academics, sabbatical means a rest from certain parts of work, so that you can really double down on other work. So I think there's at least a contradiction there going on. So having said that, I am on sabbatical, which means I am not actually teaching this fall. I am still very involved in a lot of administrative and service things at the university, perhaps more than I should have, but I do find them interesting to do. But I am doing research, and the main thing I'm doing right now is I am writing a book. That's been my main project all summer. Is a book on the Parliament of Canada, which has been in train for a little while, but there has not been a comprehensive book written on the Parliament of Canada for over 30 years, and so I think that there might be a need for a new one. And I've been thinking about Parliament for a long time, so I have been writing this book. So that's been my main project is writing this book. Some of the things I've been looking at a bit have been at Parliament under COVID-19. That's always been really interesting to watch how the Parliament of Canada and also other legislatures in Canada and elsewhere have dealt with COVID-19, with social distancing in legislatures, with remote hearings and stuff. A lot of innovation going on there, but also a bit of confusion. Particularly as the parties have not all agreed on whether Parliament should meet remotely or what should be done. So again, where there's confusion, if that's often interesting from a scholarly point of view. So I wrote a very short piece about that in the spring, and I'm tracking that a little more. So I'm interested in that and some other aspects of Parliament are sort of my main, and that's very much my remit as the Bell Chair in Canadian Parliamentary Democracy. That's the sort of thing I should be working and thinking about. So those are some main projects. I've also been doing a lot of media commentary lately. Again, there's always interesting things happening in Canadian politics, and so I've been doing a bit of commentary on that as well. The other area of research that I've been doing, separate from parliamentary research, continues to be looking at PhD career development in Canadian political science. So, as you know, I did write a book with a co-author a couple of years ago on doing a PhD in Canada in the social sciences and humanities, and that colleague Colleen Berdal and I, along with another colleague Lisa Young, we have been doing some further work again on attitudes towards PhD career development and skills in Canadian political science. We just published an article with PS, the PS Journal, the American Political Science Association Journal, PS Political Science and Politics, I think the title is. We just published an article this summer on faculty attitudes to career development in Canadian political science based on a survey that we did. And we are hoping to do a student survey very soon, a survey of graduate students and PhD students in Canadian political science departments on their attitudes to career development. We were developing that in the spring. We thought that maybe the height of the pandemic was not the best time to run that survey, but we are planning to do that probably this fall. Again, as part. So that's a separate area that continues to be a very interesting area of research for me. So those are the main things that I am doing while I am on sabbatical.
Excellent. Sounds great. I can't wait to read them. I mean, I read the last book and it was very helpful and actually reassuring for my decision to take on a PhD. So yeah, I can't wait to see the revised version of it.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. So I said the book's out, and said then we're doing any scholarly articles. I said the latest one came out this summer from the PS Journal, and it should be viewable there.
All right, well, I don't want to take up any more of your time because I know you've got books to work on, so I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us about this stuff. This has been a great conversation.
Well, it was great to be here. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for listening. Make sure to follow us on social media. You can find us on Twitter at CU_polysci, on Instagram at CU_poly.sci, and on Facebook at carletonu.polysci.